tetanus antitoxin is what would be used in that situation a lot of times. But it actually provides immediate protection. What that antitoxin vaccine is, it's a preparation of antibodies. So it's not technically a vaccine, but what it does is it ties up any toxins that could be released if you had a tetanus infection. When we think about vaccine terminology from a Vibrio and Lepto standpoint, the terminology you'll see by the majority of the vaccine companies out there are the following abbreviations. L5 would stand for those 5 traditional strains of Lepto. L5HB would stand for the 5 traditional strains of Lepto plus the Harjo bovis strain. And then VL5HB is Vibrio, the 5 traditional strains, and Harjo bovis. Why is it important to know that and realize that? Well, we'll use a product called Virus Shield to demonstrate why it's important to look at all those letters and abbreviations. So Virus Shield 6 is the basic product, and that would be a respiratory vaccine. And you may be thinking, well, you kind of talked about 4 viral pathogens earlier. Why would they call it Virus Shield 6? The reason being is because with BVD, they have more than one variant in the vaccine. And so from a marketing standpoint, it sounds a whole lot better if you can call it Virus Shield 6 versus Virus Shield 4 or something else. So when we look at the Virus Shield product line, you have the Virus Shield 6 there, but then if you look on the left-hand side, you have Virus Shield 6 plus L5, Virus Shield 6 plus L5HB, Virus Shield 6 plus VL5, and then plus VL5HB. So just with different combinations of Lepto, Harjo bovis, and Vibrio, there's 4 different products there. So it's important to look at those so you get the one you need and the one your veterinarian recommends. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the column, all the ones that were on the left, we have those same ones, but then you can also get it with Somnus, or what we called Histophilus somni earlier, would be that component there. So if your vet told you to get a Virus Shield 6 vaccine, they probably told you a specific one. Make sure you know which specific one and which one you're getting there. And that applies to other companies and their product lines as well. I was just using this one as an example. So when we think about vaccines, what are some common types of vaccines? So we have what we call inactivated vaccines, or what we refer to in the cattle industry as a killed vaccine, and that's the term I'll use most frequently tonight. And what we're talking about there is a vaccine that's going to contain the organism or a portion of that organism that has been treated in a manner so that it's inactivated and it can't replicate or reproduce. We have toxoid vaccines, which are created from inactivated toxins. And then we have live attenuated vaccines, or what we typically would refer to as a modified live vaccine. And the way those modified live works is the organism can actually multiply, but it's been treated in a manner that it can't actually cause disease in that animal. So the ones we'll talk about most would be killed and modified live. And in most cow-calf operations, we're going to be thinking about killed vaccines most of the time. So when we think about killed versus modified live, it's very important because we have some restrictions on when we can use those products and when we shouldn't use those products. So with the modified live vaccine, we mainly think about the IBR, BVD, PI3, and BRSV would be the most common there. It's important to know there are breeding restrictions that can come along with these various modified live vaccines. And sometimes you'll see the statement safe for pregnant cows with a little asterisk. It's very important you read the fine print that goes along with that asterisk, because a lot of times it says safe for pregnant cows, assuming the cows have been vaccinated with this specific protocol previously. When we look at modified live, we kind of handle those or think about those a little differently when we think about using them in a stocker calf situation or in a feedlot situation versus in breeding animals. Modified live, IBR, and BVD specifically, use in breeding age females. There's a lot of varying opinions out there in the industry based on some research that's been conducted the last 10 to 15 years. So I'd really encourage you, before you use modified live IBR and BVD in your herd, you visit with your veterinarian. Some of the concerns that are coming out, and those concerns do appear to be growing, but where a lot of this originated from was one really big study that showed numerical reductions with the use of modified live IBR and BVD, even when they were used according to label. So in that study, they looked at cows that had historically received a modified live vaccine, and then within each herd, they broke them into 3 groups. So a group that got saline, a group that got a killed product, and a group that got the modified live product. And what they saw consistently across those herds was the group that got a modified live IBR and BVD had lower pregnancy rates compared to the groups that got either the saline or the killed product. Now, it wasn't statistically different, it was only numerical difference, but when we think about from a biological standpoint, those numerical differences can be important. So the recommendation that a lot of veterinarians make, and I'm definitely on board with this recommendation, is for most cow-calf operations, because their risk is pretty low, is just to go ahead and use killed vaccines in those situations. If your risk is much higher, then that may change, and you may consider using that modified live IBR and BVD. But again, make sure you have a good conversation with your veterinarian about the risk and benefits of using modified live in our breeding animals. So the next question that a lot of people have is, what would be some examples of some basic programs? And so I went through and put together some examples from our companies that supply vaccines to the cattle industry. Not every single one, but the majority of the companies will have an example here for. These first group of examples are going to be with killed virus components. So these examples would cover those diseases that are routinely vaccinated for, with the exception of Vibrio. As I mentioned earlier, there may be some other things you need to add in. And these are just some basic examples for you to start with. So Elanco is one of the companies. They do not offer a Clostridial vaccine at this point in time, so you would need to purchase that from another company. But to cover the respiratory viruses, as well as the lepto, the 5 traditional strains, and the Harjobovis, you could use a product called VirusShield 6 plus L5HB. And you can get that product in either a 10-dose vial or a 50-dose vial in most situations. Another company that provides killed vaccines would be BI or Boehringer Ingelheim. You can see why we call them BI. The products in the example here would be Alpha 7. It's the Clostridial vaccine here. This is one of those cases where it's really important to read the labels, because this vaccine is a little different than the other Clostridial vaccines. Most Clostridial vaccines, if we're vaccinating animals that have never been vaccinated before, so thinking about calves here, we would need to give them an initial dose and then follow that up with another dose, and then after that it would be an annual booster. Because of the adjuvant that's in the Alpha 7 product, we actually only have to give 1 dose initially. We don't have to follow it up with that second dose. We just give 1 dose initially and then 1 dose every year after. Now, I do want you to know with the Alpha 7 product line, it will put a little bigger knot on those calves, so just be aware of that. Instead of a golf ball size knot that we see a lot with a lot of our Clostridial vaccines, we'll see a knot that's about the size of the tennis ball there. Nothing wrong with those knots. That's just the way the immune system reacts to the vaccine sometimes. So don't worry about that if you do see those knots, but do realize with this particular product that knot's a little bit bigger. From a respiratory standpoint, and then our lepto standpoint, the product there would be Triangle 10 HB. So you can see with these first 2 examples, to cover those routinely vaccinated diseases, just with 2 products, we can get a lot of those pathogens covered. If we look at some examples with modified live products, and going to have a few more restrictions you have to be aware of here, and this is where I would really make sure you visit with your veterinarian, is if you're looking at products from Merck, Vision 7 would be that 7-way Clostridial vaccine. And then they have, from a modified live respiratory standpoint, they have a product called Vista. And it's important to know that product is only labeled for use prior to breeding. And so if you were using this product in your cow herd, basically you would need to get in there and use it between when those cows calved and when the breeding season started, and really at least a few weeks before the breeding season started. So be aware of that. And it would only get the 5 traditional strains of Lepto. They don't have a product that would contain the Harjo bovis in it. If we look at the Zoetis product line, from a Clostridial standpoint, Ultravac 7 would be an option. From a Lepto standpoint, their terminology is a little bit different. So you see the product Spirovac L5 there on the right-hand side of the screen. The L5 is the 5 traditional strains of Lepto. The Spirovac would be the Harjo bovis strain. And then from a respiratory standpoint, the option there would be a product called Cattlemaster Gold FP5. And it's actually a combination of modified live, killed, as well as temperature sensitive modified live. So the temperature sensitive modified live would be the IBR and PI3. The killed would be the BVD, and then the true modified live would be BRSV there. So with those 4 companies, those are kind of some basic examples to cover those diseases that we routinely vaccinate for. If we look at timing of vaccine in our operation, so initial vaccines in calves, a lot of times we're looking at trying to get that in those calves around 2 to 3 months of age. So that Clostridial vaccine, that respiratory vaccine, and then that Lepto vaccine. And then from a booster standpoint, in a perfect situation, we would come back typically 3 to 6 weeks later, depending on the label, and booster those animals. Logistically, that's not always workable for a lot of operations. So there are operations that'll go in there a few weeks pre-weaning and give that booster vaccine. Or if you're weaning those cattle on your operation and not moving them anywhere, because we just don't see sickness when cattle are weaned on the home ranch correctly, you can wait a week to 10 days after you wean those calves to get that booster vaccine. You notice there I didn't put the day of weaning as a timing, because from an ideal standpoint on weaning day, we want to minimize the amount of stuff we do. So if you can avoid vaccinating those calves on the same day you wean them, you're going to be ahead in that situation. If that's the only opportunity you have, it's definitely much better to go ahead and vaccinate them than not. But if you can do it pre or post weaning, you're probably better off there. When we think of vaccine timing in cows, we'll talk about what would maybe the preferred, but then we'll talk about logistically what happens in a lot of situations. So from thinking about increasing antibodies in that colostrum from a Clostridial vaccines, pre-calving a few months would maybe be the ideal situation. And then if we think about our IBR or BVD or Lepton or Vibrio, so those reproductive pathogens there, pre-breeding would be preferred. I will tell you what most operations do, including myself, is 1 time a year, a lot of times after we've got those calves weaned, so we don't have to worry about separating the cows from the calves, we'll just go ahead and vaccinate those cows with everything at that point in time. If you're palpating, that's a good time to do that as well. Another vaccine I wanted to mention real quick because it is a little different. It's not something that most people would use, but if you ever had a problem with trick, which is a protozoal parasite that's transmitted through breeding activity, you may be thinking about this vaccine. It does take 2 doses initially. It's very important to use those 2 to 4 weeks apart. And then the most important part of this is that last dose should be administered at least 4 weeks prior to the breeding season. If you haven't had an issue with trick, this may not be something you're thinking about. But I bring it up because I have seen some producers who have had an issue with trick and were using this, and they did not have the timing right, so it wasn't helping them really the way it needed to. When it comes to vaccines, it's important to reassess your program yearly. And the reason being is because there's new research that comes out. There could be a change in the available vaccine. We see that quite a bit. There may be a change in the risk level in your operation. Maybe you're doing something different than you were before. We do see some label changes on some products. I actually pulled a product up before we started, and there was a label that it had changed a little bit from the previous label that I had in my files. And then there's new products that come on the market. And so when you're reassessing this vaccine program, that's a good time to be visiting with your vet about that. A question that often comes up is, can you give too many vaccines at one time? Definitely, there's certain vaccines that can cause an endotoxin issue. And if you start adding in pink eye vaccines and some other vaccines that could become a concern, if we kind of stick to those vaccines we talked about routinely vaccinating for, those would not exceed endotoxin guidelines given by many in the industry. Just before we get into biosecurity here in a minute, just wanted to kind of do a reminder when we think about protection level claims on vaccines. So a lot of times there's a misconception that if we give a vaccine, it's going to prevent that person or that animal from getting infected. And here we're specifically talking about animals. And some vaccines can do that, but that's not the case for most vaccines. So when we think of level of protection claims, the very best would be prevention of infection. The next would be prevention of disease. So you may be infected by the pathogen, or that cow may be infected by the pathogen, but not get sick from it. Aid in prevention of disease, aid in the disease control, and then there can be some other claims as well. So just realize, just because you see a pathogen may be in a vaccine, one product may not be the same as another because of the levels of protection when it comes to the claims there. And then when we think about biosecurity and cow-calf operations, if we're bringing new animals in, if you can isolate those new animals for at least 2 weeks, that's good. 4 weeks would be better, but there's not a perfect time there, and it kind of depends on what's going on. But the really nice thing about 2 weeks is it lets you get those animals in and just make sure they don't get sick before you turn them in with any other animals. If they do get sick, then obviously you would want to extend that isolation period. Another valuable thing to do when you bring those new animals in is I would look at deworming them, just so you're not bringing in additional parasites to your property. And then when we think about during the winter time, treating for lice would be very valuable in that situation. And when we think about isolating them, just like was being discussed earlier from an equine standpoint, we want to keep some distance between those animals. So not just the fence line, we want to avoid any kind of nose-to-nose contact between those animals. So hopefully you have a pasture and you don't have anything in the next pasture when you're isolating those animals from a biosecurity standpoint. One of the things or diseases we really think about from a biosecurity standpoint would be trick. And what trick is, just briefly, it's a protozoal parasite that's transmitted through breeding activity. So the bull can pass it to a cow can pass it to a bull. And it'll cause abortions in those cows. So we're going to lose a number of calves. And typically, if we think about a herd that doesn't have trick and was running 90–95% pregnancy rates, and then we had quite a few trick infested animals, we would expect those pregnancy rates to drop down to maybe 45, 50, 55% in there somewhere. The best thing we can do to avoid that is make sure we never have trick come on to our property. So good fences can be very important. You don't want the neighbor's bull jumping the fence or coming through the fence and breeding your cows. if he was infected, he can get your cows infected, causing abortions, and then your cows could infect your bull. If you do have a neighbor bull come over, you may want to work with that neighbor to make sure you get that bull tested so you know what your risk situation is there. And any herd that he was exposed to, if you have multiple herds on your property, you would want to make sure you kept those separated until you knew the status there. With trick, and why we really focus on it from a biosecurity standpoint, is once a bull gets infected, he's infected. We don't have any kind of treatment, approved treatment for trick in bulls. So really that breeding bull, we're just looking at having to cull him in that situation. When we look on the female side of things, with rest from breeding activity, most of those females can clear a trick infection, and we can kind of work our way through that, but bulls cannot. So the best thing to do is make sure we prevent that through biosecurity measures. Big thing is good fences. And then the other thing is make sure when you're buying bulls, you know the reproductive history, and you're not buying bulls that you don't know the reproductive history on. The other thing, there is a test for trick out there. Realize because of the challenges in collecting a sample, just because a bull is negative on the trick test does not mean 100% he's negative. So buying bulls from a high risk situation, even if they test negative, you really want to think through that situation there. So buying young bulls who really haven't had been out breeding cows would be ideal in most situations there. If we are needing a trick test, a lot of experts on trick would tell you they would want to see at least, depending on whether you're using a PCR test or a culture test, at least 2 or 3 negative tests before they would really feel comfortable calling that bull negative from a trick standpoint. Those are the topics I really wanted to cover tonight. If anybody has any future questions, feel free to get hold of Jessica and she can get in touch with me, or my email is on the screen there. Jessica, was there any other things you wanted me to add or cover based on questions that have been coming in?
No, that was absolutely great. I know that the importance of vaccines, I think sometimes people forget. They get complacent, and we get a lot of calls. I know at my office that someone thinks their cow drank pond water and it killed their cow, but when I ask if their cattle have been vaccinated, they say no, and it's a lot more likely that that's the culprit compared to pond water or a poisonous plant.
Yeah, definitely. That's something we always need to know, the vaccine history in that herd, so we can rule that out, or so we can explore that as a potential cause of death. And I didn't mention it, but when we look at vaccines for the cow herd, if we kind of look at some of those examples we talked about, historically, we're talking somewhere $3 to $6 per cow per year. So we're not talking about a lot of money there. And then from a calf standpoint, that same cost, but obviously if we're boostering it, it would be double there. But if you just think about preventing Clostridial disease and preventing losing one of those calves, you can pay for a lot of vaccine for a lot of years. So really good insurance policy there when we look at the low cost of that vaccine.
Dr. Banna, this is Dr. Hayes. That was an excellent presentation. I was a dairy and beef cattle veterinarian for 23 years. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I'd encourage people not to scrimp on vaccines. I had one time when I was vaccinating some of my own animals on a weekend. My practice, I had run out of 8-way Clostridial vaccine and just didn't have any, and I needed to get the animals vaccinated. So I went to Tractor Supply and bought some 7-way. And consequently, a few months later, I lost 6 animals from Redwater. So enough to pay for probably a vaccine the rest of my life. So it's really important. Another thing too is when people buy animals, whether it be private treaty or however they buy them, if they buy them at a livestock market, assume they've had nothing. And then also, if they buy them from an individual that says they've been vaccinated, assume they've had nothing. Because a lot of times people think they've given what they should and they are not even close. I've noticed a procedural drift too. as people may have even worked with a veterinarian and developed a vaccination program, over time, they will not realize that they've actually picked up the wrong bottles of vaccine over time, and they're not even close to what they had started doing when they consulted with a veterinarian. So anyway, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and great comments. I appreciate those. And just to kind of add to that last comment a little bit, our extension veterinarian, when he was in private practice, was sharing a story that related to that perfectly, where he had worked with a big outfit and this is what they were supposed to use, but when it came time to order it, their vaccine supplier was out, so they switched this for that and switched this for that without calling and double checking with him. And when he got to looking at it, because of some changes they made, there was one component that actually vaccinated the cattle for triple because it was in multiple versions of what they bought. So it's important to pay attention to what you're buying and what that veterinarian said. And I didn't mention it, but I'll go ahead and mention it now since Dr. Hayes brought up dairy. What we were talking about here was for beef cattle. Dairy cattle are a little bit different, and so we have to be a little more cautious with how we vaccinate those. So if you are dealing with dairy animals, definitely make sure you visit with your veterinarian there because we do have those dairy cattle can be a little bit more sensitive to some of our vaccines out there. Anything else you want to add, Dr. Hayes?
No, that's exactly right. And also the timing of vaccinations, you do them different with dairy cattle, depending on their production cycle. So that was excellent. And the other thing is to consult with a good cattle veterinarian. There are actually very few of us nowadays around that primarily do just that. And they are out there, but you really have to hunt for them. So.
Yeah, and you said it, and I'm going to reiterate it again, because you need somebody who's working with cattle on a regular basis because things change, and to keep up with what's going on, your small animal veterinarian may not be the same person that needs to be your cattle veterinarian, and you will have numerous veterinarians tell you that. So I'll just tell you personally, we drive past quite a few veterinarians just so I have a veterinarian who works on cattle on a routine basis if I need that veterinarian. So a cattle veterinarian is key here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banta. That was fantastic. So our next speaker is going to be, sorry, I have to pull my screen up. It's going to be Dr. Audrey McElroy, and she's the interim department head and extension poultry specialist.
All right, thanks, Jessica. Let me see if I can get my slide shared here. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and Jessica, thank you for organizing a great program that I think is timely and has a lot of good information for these different species, and I appreciate you including the poultry aspect of it.
I'm going to pause you. It's showing the presenter mode this time. When we practiced, it did it perfectly.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, we did. Let's look at, we can get this changed here. That help any?
Nope.
Well, this two screen thing, let's see.
It knows.
Let's try it. Did that help any?
It's still showing us the presenter mode.
All right, how do I get off of this? Let's look, because I really don't need that. Display settings, swap. Let's try this. How about that?
There you go.
Excellent. Okay. All right. No, I appreciate you including, us on the poultry side of things. it's a little bit different perspective, right? Because from the standpoint of poultry, there's not a lot of vaccines available for those that have, the small backyard flocks. And so we're really focused a lot more on disease prevention from the biosecurity standpoint. And that, we don't have the opportunity just to go to Tractor Supply, or, it's really even difficult getting in contact with a poultry vet that can supply poultry vaccines. So we look at it from a little bit different perspective, in that we focus very heavily on the biosecurity aspect to try to prevent disease. And so there's really two different diseases that we think about in terms of poultry production. And one of those is diseases of detriment to bird health. So those things that we're going to see the birds get sick, we may see a change in feed consumption, water consumption. Birds will obviously get ruffled feathers, changes in the fecal production that's coming out of them. And so we see that those birds are impacted in terms of how they're feeling. The other side of things is more of an impact on the human health side. So when we think about diseases like Salmonella or Campylobacter that are often associated with poultry, those are natural bacteria that are found in birds. And so they may not cause any disease to the birds at all. You can have a whole flock that's infected with Salmonella, but you won't see any change in the health condition of birds. But both of them are, extremely important when we think about preventing the spread of those diseases from one backyard flock to another, and especially preventing, spread to commercial flocks, which are very prevalent in Texas as well. So there's a number of different causes of diseases that we think of in terms of poultry. Obviously the pathogens, right? So bacteria, viruses, parasites, protozoa, fungi, those things that, are going to make the birds sick, that are coming from some kind of infectious route. But then we also, need to consider things like nutritional deficiencies, chemical poisons, over medication, and more commonly, probably poor management that results in stress to the birds and increases their chance of becoming sick. So while tonight we're mainly focusing on those pathogens that are infectious, there's also a number of other things that contribute to the health of the birds that really can't be prevented in terms of biosecurity, but we need to think about it in terms of how we manage those birds. So what is biosecurity from the standpoint of poultry, or really any, species of livestock? It's what can we do to protect those animals from disease? So it's a preventative type of measure, as well as also preventing spread from one facility to another once there is a disease flock. So we think about it in terms of two types of biosecurity, one of those being structural, where we're talking about pens or coops or poultry houses, or even poultry farms from the standpoint of a commercial operation where we may have 125,000 chickens on one single farm. We also consider operational types of biosecurity. And so that's where we start thinking about the day-to-day practices, the procedures, the policies that we put in place to try to prevent the spread of disease. So in terms of biosecurity, right, basically trying to control any disease-causing organism as well as the vectors. And so those are the things that carry disease from one place to another. And that may be humans, it may be insects, it may be the wind that blows things that are airborne from one house to another, which can occur very commonly in the poultry industry and amongst backyard flocks as well. We really want, most of all, right, to control transmission of disease from flock to flock. And so that may be a flock of 5 chickens that's in somebody's backyard to, a neighboring flock of 20 that are at a cousin's house down the road, or someone else in the neighborhood. And then even from the standpoint of carrying that over to, like I said, a commercial flock that may have hundreds of thousands of birds on it, where it gets to be a very serious measure. So what do we think about in terms of preventative measures, right? What's costly, what's most cost effective, right? We look at different things. So biosecurity in general is really the cheapest, most effective means of disease control. So we're not thinking about buying, really expensive types of equipment or investing in things that are going to cost us a lot of money. It's very simple procedural type of things that we can do on a day-to-day basis in managing the birds and thinking about the way we move from dealing with chickens in the backyard to other places we may be going that day that help to prevent disease. So it is the most effective way and the cheapest way that we can prevent disease in poultry operations. So there's really some basics that have been talked about quite a bit. So keep your distance, and we're going to talk about all these a little bit more, but keep your distance, right? And that's from other flocks, from any type of waterfowl, from any type of pet bird operations, right? Even if you're going into pet stores where they have birds, and then you also have chickens at home, that becomes an important consideration. Keep it clean. Anything related to something you're using in your backyard flock, it needs to be clean. It means not sharing it with neighbors. It means cleaning up between usage or between different flocks that you have coming in. Don't haul disease home. And so we're going to talk a lot about where the birds are purchased, other things you may be bringing into your backyard flock operation that would result in a big difference in terms of disease control. Don't borrow diseases from your neighbor. So any type of equipment, right? Feeding equipment, drinking equipment, tractors, if you're borrowing lawnmowers, anything that could, right, become contaminated with fecal material, feathers, and easily be carried from one premise to another becomes very, very important. It's also critical, right, to know the warning signs of infectious bird diseases, to know what a normal bird looks like, and then to know what a bird looks like when it's not feeling well. And immediately, right, when we see those signs of some type of disease occurring, it becomes very important to report those sick birds. And that may be to a local vet. There's not a lot of vets that specialize in terms of poultry health, but there are some that do. Many local vets do know to reach out to, say, for example, the Poultry Science Department, or to TVMDL, the Texas Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab, under conditions where they may need some input in terms of sick bird diagnosis. So making calls to report those becomes very, very important on a timely basis. So just kind of to, I guess, reiterate, right, why it's so important, not only in Texas, but throughout the United States when we think about biosecurity with poultry. If we look at the different types of backyard flocks that exist, I've highlighted here in red, the Southwest region is where we would fit into in terms of Texas. The majority of flocks are going to be table egg type of production facilities. So just having a few chickens in the backyard that produce eggs that may be consumed by the family, they may be given to neighbors down the road. Some folks will market those eggs, but those egg production breeds are going to be the most common. If you look at some of the others that show up quite a bit, it's interesting, right, to see how prevalent ducks are in terms of backyard flocks in Texas or in the Southwest region. Guinea fowls are also up above 20%, so quite a variety, right? We do see some chickens that show up about 8.5% in terms of show or exhibition, but that's not a huge portion of it. And then a lot of those, right, that are kind of the market poultry type of birds that youth raise for showing at Houston Livestock Show, San Antonio Livestock Show, those tend to be very short-term type of projects. So when we're talking about chickens from that standpoint, it'll be 42 days most commonly. Turkeys are going to be longer, but they tend to be short-term, so not quite as much of a concern from disease transmission as it would be from the table egg type of laying hens that may be in the backyard for years. It's also important, right, to think about how that disease spreads, right, and other premises that may be nearby presenting that opportunity for disease spread. So this table and again, I've highlighted the Southwest region where Texas would be considered, shows the number of commercial operations, so commercial production in terms of broilers or turkeys that may be produced in the area from companies, say, for example, Tyson, Sanderson, Pilgrims, that have thousands of chickens, on a single farm. If we look at those backyard flocks that are in proximity to those, there's a lot. When you may just have 5 chickens in the backyard, but you're within a mile of a commercial type of operation, it just becomes critical that we think about how we're moving, from our farm to different locations, any type of breeze that may be occurring that transmits disease from one farm to another. But it becomes critical as we think about some of these diseases that are transmitted very, very easily, like avian influenza that we're dealing with in the United States right now. So it really highlights the importance of not just controlling disease within our own backyard flocks or our neighbors' backyard flocks, but to the commercial industry as well. So a few major components to biosecurity that I'd like to hit on tonight, one being flock management, traffic control, isolation, and then some cleaning and sanitation procedures. We'll also talk about a few, what I think are really common diseases that people may see in their backyard birds that we get calls about in the poultry science department quite often. So in terms of sanitation, right, it's kind of a challenge in our backyard type of poultry because we never really have a total clean out under most common circumstances. So in the commercial industry, we'll bring in, day of age chicks with maybe 30,000 of them in a house. They bring them in on a single day. They're raised for 42 days. Those birds then move out to go to processing, and there's a matter of time, typically 10 days to 2 weeks, where that house is empty. And that gives the poultry grower the opportunity to totally clean and disinfect that facility to reduce any disease that may be present, right? The longer that facility sits empty, the less chance you have for disease transmission. We don't see that as much in backyard flocks because people tend to add to the flock over time. So you may start with 2 laying hens and you add a few more and you add a few more, and there's never really a time for a total clean out. So there needs to be some thought given to, especially if you do see sick birds, right? Moving those birds to a quarantine type of place where you can disinfect the premises. And that's really a multi-step process. It's not as easy as just going in and spraying some disinfectant, on top of the dirt. It needs to be a situation where you're removing as much organic material as possible. So that's fecal material, it's dust, it's cobwebs, it's feathers, really cleaning out that facility as well as you can. Once you remove that organic matter, which is very, very important because any of that material will inactivate your disinfectant very, very quickly. So remove that organic material, then go in with a soap or cleaner, something that's a surfactant that will release bacteria and other surface contamination, right? Clean it really well with that soap or cleaner. Rinse it, preferably with a pressure washer that will provide some physical force, right, to wash off anything as well. And then allow it to dry and totally, totally dry. Not just, okay, well, most of it's dry and now I'm going to spray a disinfectant. You want it to totally dry so that when that disinfectant is sprayed, you're not diluting the disinfectant that you're applying. The other part of allowing it to totally dry is that the drying process itself is very detrimental to bacteria and viruses and living organisms, right, that are going to survive if a moist environment is present. So by allowing it to dry, you actually help reduce the number of pathogens that you have there as well. Then follow the label guidelines to apply a disinfectant really well, right, to the premises, to the equipment, anywhere that those birds have been. Remember though, right, that any disinfectant you have is typically going to lose efficacy over time. So something that you bought 2 years ago that you had to buy in a 10-gallon container, but you only used a small portion of it, there's a good chance that it may have been inactivated, particularly if it's held in conditions where there's a lot of heat in Texas, right, sunlight. All of those things are going to inactivate our disinfectant. So it's always a good idea to make sure you have something fresh, to make sure it's active against the type of bacteria or viruses that you're trying to treat. And there's a number of them that you can purchase, at local co-ops, feed stores, Tractor Supply, that can be used in all types of livestock facilities. But it's really important, right, that we're trying to clean these environments at some point in time. All right, in terms of isolation, and I think everybody's hit on this so far, whether it was with equine or cattle, but thinking about the animals that you're introducing to the flock is extremely important, right? And I would caution very, very strongly against purchasing chickens, guinea, turkeys, peacock, whatever it may be from, local live bird markets. That's just a scary situation. Many times it may be that people are selling those birds from their flock, for a reason. It's not uncommon that people may see birds that are smaller, that aren't acting well, and they remove those from the flock, right? And they get given to somebody else or sold to somebody else. And they're really not the birds you're wanting to bring home. So in terms of the safest place to obtain birds, the safest place to add new birds to your flock would be to purchase from a commercial hatchery that sells different types of breeds, lots of them available, right? So Stromberg's is a hatchery, Ideal Poultry, which is down in Cameron, Texas. You can go online and buy, just about any type of breed of birds you want. The great thing about those hatcheries is they participate in the National Poultry Improvement Plan, NPIP, which does provide, a certain degree of health certification for those birds. Those birds have typically been provided any type of vaccine they may need that gives you an added, assurance, I think, into the health of the birds that you're bringing into your flock. It just gets really scary to go out and buy, chickens or any type of bird from someone that you're not familiar with and then bring that home. And I think that's the most common type of scenario we get calls about is, I've had these laying hens that are 2 years old. I went out and bought some birds that are 2 months old and brought them in, and now I'm starting to see some mortality. So very, very important, not only for those birds you already have existing in your backyard flock, but the new birds coming in as well, right? That we try to get them from a good source where we know the health is somewhat guaranteed. You really want, if you bring in new birds, quarantine them. I mean, I say a minimum of 2 weeks. If you can do it for a month, it's much better, right? So provide them a separate area where you rear them. If it's baby chicks, you're going to need to be thinking about providing a warm environment, different type of feeding regimens for those birds, but separating them from older birds that you have on the farm. It's also a really good idea to make sure you're separating birds. If you have chickens and you have turkeys and you have guineas, separating those is a much better idea because there is disease transmission that can occur from one of those to the other that we can prevent by raising them separately. It's best, right? And this is somewhat difficult with backyard flocks, but maintaining them in somewhat of a confined environment, right? Whether it's with fencing, some folks will use netting, things that can keep those birds on your premises, right? As well as prevent wild birds from coming into your premise and maybe eating the same poultry feed, drinking from the same waters, right? You want to minimize as much as possible any wild bird entry into facilities where you have your backyard flocks. And we'll talk about that some more with avian influenza here in a bit. Very important to avoid contact with migratory waterfowl, any type of migratory bird, if you have poultry at home. Especially with AI on the rise like it is, most commonly it's found in waterfowl. And the thing about it is, right, I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of diseases that infect birds, but it's a natural pathogen, right? It's a natural virus. Waterfowl typically with low pathogenic avian influenza do not show any signs of disease. So they can be spreading that disease and we don't even know that they're sick. And so that's the most important thing, is really trying to prevent any contact with any birds other than those that you have in your backyard flock. It's very, very important. It also comes to look at the standpoint of controlling traffic onto your premises, right? And thinking about if you go to other premises where there's birds and then come back to your house as well. We want to restrict all visitors as much as possible. The top picture there shows, something that's pretty common on our commercial type of operations, but they'll actually have signs posted for disease control that say no visitors. And you have to sign in a logbook so that if those birds become sick, right, they have some ability to track who was on that farm on what day, what other farms they may have gone to try to track down that spread of disease. We don't see that in backyard flocks as much. And you think about, times of spring break or summertime where kids are getting together and they go out and play with the chickens in the backyard and then they go home to their own houses where they may have chickens in the backyard, and it just becomes very easily spread of disease from one to the other. Having footwear, whether it be an old pair of tennis shoes, a pair of rubber boots, that are things that you only wear into your poultry house, right? Or into the backyard where the birds are. They're not things you're going to wear to town or to the neighbor's house, but they're dedicated to your facility, right? So that if they do become contaminated, you're not going to transmit it from one place to the other. And then I think things that we commonly, maybe don't think about as you go out and handle your birds, pick up eggs in the morning, and then go somewhere else and, haven't washed your hands. Whereas bacteria, viruses, everything, right? Most commonly spread by our hands. And so thinking about not just our feet and our clothing, but also just hand disinfection as we move from one facility to another. That bottom picture came from a farm that I visited. I lived in Virginia for 15 years. And sweet, elderly neighbor next to a commercial farm there. We had gone out to talk to her about some sick birds she had. And she said, well, I have my, sign posted to try to deter visitors from coming in to see the birds. And I said, well, I noticed like the beautiful flowers you had blooming. So it said, no trespassing, last warning. And she said, yeah, the flowers kind of covered it up, but at the bottom it says you will be shot. So she was pretty serious about, preventing visitors to her farm because she cared quite a bit about her birds. So, things that you, I think, may definitely see in Texas, right, is people being protective of their facilities is pretty important. Pest control, right, becomes very important as well. And that's not just thinking about those wild birds, right? They are a huge vector in terms of disease transmission and things we need to think about keeping out. But mice, right? We've got a readily supply available source of feed, water. A lot of poultry, premises tend to be warm, especially when we have chicks. So rodents are attracted to that area. Insects, darkling beetles is something we see a lot in poultry operations. Other insects that are coming in, right? Crickets, grasshoppers. Any of these can transmit disease. Some of them harbor disease, right? And can transmit it from one place to another. Flies are a great source of it, right? So they light on fecal material, travel to a neighbor's farm, they can transmit disease by that source as well. Cats is another thing, right? Some folks will use cats as a form of rodent control, but then thinking about the transmission of disease by those cats becomes critical as well, right? If they're out roaming the neighborhood, they can very easily carry disease from one place to another. So, it's really thinking about what's moving from your backyard flock to another flock. Or, right, vice versa, what's coming from a neighbor's flock to your flock that becomes really important. And it's another thing, right, is not necessarily thinking about the disease itself, but thinking about what predisposes the birds to disease. And that happens most commonly, right, when there's some type of stress condition. So if the birds go off a feed for some reason, right, or it's a very poor diet that's being fed, if there's dirty water, if birds are in an environment where there's not good ventilation provided, right? If they're closed up in a house where they're not getting a lot of air circulation, that tends to damage their respiratory system, makes them very susceptible to disease. So thinking about providing an environment where the birds receive very little stress is also a very good way to prevent disease spread amongst your birds. All right, so, I said one thing is recognizing when birds are healthy, right? And I think that's pretty easy to see. They're drinking, they're eating, they're pecking at the ground, they're out, walking around looking for insects. But being able to recognize when the birds are not feeling well becomes very, very important. One of the things that we'll see most commonly that initiates a bird not feeling well is they'll back off on food and water consumption. So if you begin to see, right, that a bird just doesn't want to go eat and drink, it tends to sit. Sometimes they'll dig a little hole in the litter. Sometimes, like you'll see in this picture, they get ruffled feathers. They may lose feathers. Those are all indications that those birds are not feeling well. You don't, here on this slide, it says coughing and sneezing. That's not really a response that birds get, but it is what people tend to hear. So when they get respiratory issues, you'll hear a lot of rattling, like a rattly type of sound when they breathe, and what some people call snicking. So it'd be like, it sounds like a really small sneeze, like tss, tss, tss. You hear this noise going on. And that's telling you there's an irritation to the respiratory system. You'll also see watery eyes is really common. So you'll see a lot of drainage on the side underneath the eyes. And you'll actually, I think I have a picture in a minute, but you'll see that the wings of the birds get dirty because they'll tend to move their head back and wipe the eyes, trying to get some of that moisture off. You may see them pecking at feathers of each other, particularly if it's things like lice or mites that are in your environment. So really just watching bird behavior gives you the absolute best indicator as to how birds are feeling. It becomes critical, right? If you do see a bird that's not feeling well, because under most circumstances, right, it's going to start with one bird or maybe just two birds in your flock. Removing those birds immediately becomes very, very important, right? And at least quarantining them to a separate area. Some people, will take the most extreme step and go ahead and euthanize those birds or take them to the vet, send them into a diagnostic lab in order to get them examined. But at least removing them from the flock to a quarantine situation is the best first step you can take, right? Because you don't want that spreading to other birds. Checking birds periodically for lice, mites, worms, those sorts of things becomes very, very important just in terms of maintaining a healthy condition. All right, let's talk a little bit about just some of the most common things we tend to see in backyard poultry. Coccidiosis is a big one, right? And this is a disease, protozoal parasite. It is one of the most common things we see, not only in backyard birds, but in our commercial flocks as well. It's been around forever. There's no way to get rid of it. There's not a good vaccine that prevents it from happening. So it's a matter really of allowing the birds to survive when they get exposed to Eimeria. Eimeria is the parasite that causes coccidia. Birds will typically survive it unless it's a very, very strong infection. But birds may back off a feed. You're going to see a change in their fecal material. So to go from a kind of solid consistency to something that's very watery, very runny. You may see blood in the fecal material depending on what kind of coccidia it is. And they'll have ruffled feathers like you see in this picture. The best thing you can do, right, is to continue to just provide proper management to those birds. It's kind of one of those diseases where once the birds, right, get exposed to it and we can feed the birds through that infection, they then develop immunity. So, somebody, I think it was when we were talking about the equine diseases earlier, the analogy was made of, well, when you send your kids to daycare, right, they're going to get exposed to things. That's kind of like coccidia. When we have chickens, we know they're going to, at some point, probably become infected with coccidia. But the good news is they're going to survive that infection. And then once they do, they become resistant to that disease. Now, the challenge becomes, right, if you have birds that are 2 years old, they will no longer be impacted by coccidia once they've been exposed to it. But if you bring in baby chicks that you purchased and you put those birds out with, right, those older birds, it can become a much more damaging infection for the younger birds, right? They may still survive it, but you may see those birds look pretty sick as they get through it. Good thing is, right, most of your commercial rations will often contain a coccidia stat. So it's a medicated diet that helps prevent severe outbreaks. Some of the medications will allow what we call leaking of coccidia. So it's a very mild challenge, right? Mild exposure to the disease that allows them to develop immunity. Ways that we can help, right, in terms of minimizing this is preventing wet litter, right, or a wet environment where you're housing them, preventing overcrowding. We want to make sure that feed's available at all times. Anytime chickens go off a feed, it tends to cause some damage to their intestinal tract, which makes them more susceptible to some diseases. And like I said earlier, try to prevent any type of stress, okay? So Feed medication is great, managing the environment that the birds are in, and also thinking about how we're commingling ages of birds until they've developed immunity becomes very, very important with coccidiosis. Some other diseases that, we commonly get calls about from backyard flocks would be colobacillosis or E. coli infection. That's one that typically results from some type of stress to the bird that makes them more prone to this disease. So it does happen quite a bit when the birds have poor air quality, when there's not great ventilation in poultry houses. So we'll see air sac infection. Birds have very different respiratory systems than what we have as humans or what most animals have, right? So they move the majority of the air through their respiratory system with what we call air sacs. They're like huge bellows or balloons that push the air through the system. And when there's overcrowding and poor air quality, whether that be dust, ammonia from the fecal material, what happens is those air sacs are damaged and they become very prone to infection. And so they'll get a really cloudy appearance. The birds can't breathe as well. And you'll hear that kind of rattly sound, right? Or what it sounds like the birds are sneezing. When birds get stressed, we tend to see what's called ascites or flip over. So if you have bigger birds, particularly if they're meat type of production birds or birds that grow very rapidly, they tend to be more prone to overheating and fast growth. And what happens is they basically go through heart failure. And when they do, and they have a heart attack, then they flip over. So if you see a lot of birds that, you're raising that flip over, it's probably a good indication that they've been overstressed, they're too hot, right? And it's resulted in heart conditions for them. Slip tendons, that's the bottom picture, right? There's really no treating this. We do see it. It's a problem sometimes with birds get heavier, or it can be a problem just in terms of a malfunction, the way those tendons were formed when they were chicks, and that leg will splay out to the side, right? There's really no way to prevent this from happening other than keeping the birds on a walking environment, right, where they have good grip. You don't want them on a really slick type of flooring. But other than that, there's really not any way you can prevent it, right? So at that point, it really becomes an animal welfare issue, and it's better to remove that bird from your flock. I mentioned external parasites earlier. So some of the ones we more commonly see are the scaly leg mites, the poultry lice, and the northern fowl mites, right? So if you start to see birds that are picking feathers out, that are scratching a lot, that have a lot of broken feathers, make sure you're checking for these external parasites. There's a number of treatments that can be given for them that are available at local feed stores, dusting type of products that can very easily help you to get rid of these. But make sure you're checking the birds from those if you see a lot of damage to feathers or itching on the birds, that sort of thing. All right, let's talk a little bit about avian influenza, because right now it's a pretty critical situation in the United States as well as globally. Okay, and it happens occasionally over the years. We see this problem crop up, but it becomes probably the most important point that we think about in terms of biosecurity, because with avian influenza, there's not any type of preventative medicine that we can give these birds. There's no effective vaccine that we're giving to backyard birds or to commercial birds. So it is really a problem that we've got to stop by good biosecurity, right? By preventing the spread of it. There's no treatment for it. The only treatment for avian influenza is to kill the birds. So we must prevent this disease from happening, okay? And that's by these good biosecurity practices. Avian influenza, it's a virus that's caused by a type A virus. It is found in over 100 different species of wild birds. So it is not uncommon to find this in wild birds. Most likely wild aquatic birds is where it typically shows up. Their natural host, they show no symptoms. So you go out to a pond, right? There's all kinds of ducks there, particularly during the season where these birds are migrating. it would not be uncommon for there to be avian influenza in some of those birds. Now, the problem that really happens, right, is one of two things, is when that avian influenza is transmitted to domestic poultry, right, backyard flocks or commercial flocks that we have in the industry. Secondly is when that avian influenza, which is typically what we call a low pathogenic or low disease causing strain, mutates and becomes highly pathogenic and begins to kill birds. That's when it's even more critical, not only for backyard flocks, but for commercial operations as well. So what we've got to do is think about how we prevent the spread of this disease when it's present a lot of the time, okay? So low pathogenic avian influenza, that is the most common form, right? So you're not going to see signs of disease or maybe very mild disease. In a commercial operation with low pathogenic avian influenza, particularly in egg production type of birds, you're going to see that they slow down in terms of egg production. You won't see a lot of mortality. You may see very mild signs that those birds do not feel well in terms of them backing off of feed and water. You may see a few respiratory signs, but you don't typically see a lot of mortality. Now, the extreme to that is when it becomes highly pathogenic avian influenza. This is severe, right? Not only for the commercial poultry industry, but for backyard flocks as well. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, we're going to look at mortality up to the 90 to 100% rate. So birds get it very quickly. They typically die within 24 to 48 hours, and it spreads extremely rapidly. So we really, every year, every day, have got to be on the lookout for avian influenza across the United States and globally. And that's really, I think one of the reasons that biosecurity became such a hot topic in the poultry industry is from past situations with avian influenza, right? Where we realized it was people that were spreading the disease. It was things like feathers that were being, dropped from one premise to another. It was people walking in one poultry house and going into another poultry house with a dime-sized amount of fecal material on their shoe that then spread the disease over miles, right, once it started through poultry flocks. So we've got to be very careful. It's huge for the commercial poultry industry because when we do experience avian influenza, it also tends to result in a shutdown of trade of poultry products. So it becomes a huge economic issue in addition to it being a huge health issue for the poultry. I mentioned I lived in Virginia, and I like to use this scenario because when I was there and I was working in extension for Virginia Tech, the commercial poultry industry there went through an episode of avian influenza, and it was devastating to the industry. So there in Virginia, they have a commingling somewhat of the industry in the Shenandoah Valley. So it really is a valley. Largest county in terms of turkey production in the United States. They also rank very high in broiler production. So it's a very dense population of poultry. Over a period of several months, they had to destroy over 4.6 million commercial poultry. In addition to that, it wiped out a number of backyard flocks that were in that area. So it was absolutely devastating. Now, it didn't cause any problems, right, in terms of human health or in food safety concerns, but economically, it was huge to the poultry industry, right? It was devastating to the farmers that raised those birds. It, was devastating to those that had the backyard flocks that were impacted. There were over 197 poultry farms, and it ended up costing the poultry industry about $130 million. So this is a type of scenario that we do not want to get in again. Since 2001, there's been a number of isolated incidences of low-path avian influenza showing up. There's been a few incidences of high pathogenic avian influenza showing up. But in general, the commercial poultry industry and anyone involved in poultry has been pretty good at preventing the spread of it, right? So if you look at this chart, right, I think, I mentioned that it spreads very rapidly. And this was from when it occurred in Virginia. And, you see the first flock that showed up as positive was March the 3rd. And the industry experienced this epidemic until about the start of July. But you can see how the number of cases exponentially increased, and how it spread very, very rapidly over those several months, right? So we all just went through, the whole COVID situation where you saw graphs, right? Very similar to this as disease spread started to happen. So same type of thing we think about in terms of the poultry industry is because there is such a dense population, like on each farm, as well as farms being close to each other and backyard flocks being close to those farms, the spread of disease happens very, very quickly and wipes out just huge numbers of poultry, right, under a very small amount of time. Because avian influenza is so important, there is always a surveillance program in place. So they are always looking at particularly waterfowl, right, that are migrating as well as other birds throughout flyways. Very recently, right, in January, we saw high pathogenic avian influenza show up in one of these flyways in the United States. Right now it exists, or we found positive birds amongst all of the flyways in the United States from migratory birds that have been passing through. So many times it's not birds, like I said, that look sick in any way. It may be birds that are harvested by hunters, right? Duck hunters, pheasants, any type of thing where they're doing natural surveillance on these birds, and they tend to find, that one of them may be infected with avian influenza. So it showed up in the United States in January. Since that time, it's been found not only in those migratory wild aquatic birds, but it's shown up in backyard flocks of multiple different types of poultry, and it's also shown up in several commercial poultry flocks. This is the first detection of the high pathogenic avian influenza in the United States since 2016. So this is one of those things that we'd never want to happen. But like I said, it has now been detected in every major flyway. So definitely the commercial poultry industry is on an upper level of biosecurity. So they tend to have different levels. And they're at kind of, like that DEFCON 5 right now, where they're closed to all visitors, preventing as much traffic as possible. Really intense disinfection as they move vehicles between properties. So doing everything that's possible to try to prevent spread of this disease. And if you look at, kind of when it started, the first case that they reported was January 14th, and that was in a wild bird in South Carolina. And if you follow this chart moving up from then, you can see it showed up in a commercial turkey flock in Indiana, backyard flocks in Virginia, a commercial poultry flock of broiler chickens in Kentucky. That was in February. And then moving from that time, from the bottom here up through just most recently, it was in New York, Maine, Delaware, Michigan, Connecticut and Iowa, Missouri, Maryland, South Dakota, Kansas, Illinois, and most recently in Wisconsin. So thankfully, right, we have not seen this in Texas with this outbreak. But I hope that, as you consider this, right, really thinking about preventing this disease becomes of utmost importance. And it's not just the commercial poultry industry, right? It's backyard flocks that you see it showing up in. So anytime you're around, any potential vector that could spread this disease, think about movement, think about, where you've been and what you can be tracking in. This is an absolute wonderful site that's provided from USDA. It's called Defend the Flock. Lots of information here about avian influenza, as well as information just about biosecurity in general. So I encourage you, if you need more details about avian influenza, about biosecurity, visit this website. It's really good source for all types of information. It also allows you to track the spread of avian influenza. It all gets reported on this site. So look that up. Okay, try to summarize this up really quickly. Just keeping your flock healthy in terms of those biosecurity procedures. One, understanding what is posing a disease risk to your backyard flocks, whether that's feathers, whether it's wild bird nests, whether it's fecal material, or whether it's your next door neighbors that are coming in and want to go out and see the chickens. Think about every single thing that's moving in or out of the premises where you have your poultry. Check your coops, check your pens, check poultry houses, right? For anywhere that you see wild birds may be perching. If you see wild bird poop that's piling up, right? If there's a wire that's hanging in your poultry pen, or a clothesline that's out in your backyard, and those wild birds are perching there, right, and pooping where your chickens are wandering around, that can be a great opportunity for spread of things like avian influenza. Wild bird nests, right? I mean, they're great. It's fun to watch the little birds hatch out, but at the same time, right, those wild birds spread a lot of disease, right? So we need to be thinking about taking those nests away from anywhere we have backyard poultry. Any opportunity you have to remove litter and bedding and thoroughly disinfect becomes really, really important, especially if you have any signs of disease in your backyard flock. Make sure you're doing everything possible not to give wild birds, rodents, insects, really any type of other animal a free lunch, okay? So removing open access to feed, storing their feed in a secure place becomes very important, and protecting your water supply. So anytime you have wild birds coming in and eating from those same feed pans, drinking from the same drinkers, right, you're really predisposing your flock to disease. Pay close attention to and restrict movement. So don't drive or walk through areas where waterfowl or really any other wild bird fecal material may be, right? Because those birds may look perfectly healthy, but you don't know what you're stepping in and what you're transmitting back to your flock. Keep your shoes clean, preferably, right? Have a separate pair of shoes and clothing that you wear strictly in your backyard premises. And then I encourage you, right? Don't wait if you think birds are sick. So if they're sick, if they're dying, call a local vet, call our poultry science department, or call a state veterinarian. So you can also call USDA. I put their toll-free number in here. We've got a number of excellent diagnostic labs here in the state of Texas. There's one here in College Station, in Gonzales, and in Center. So they actually have people who specialize in looking at poultry, right? Backyard birds, waterfowl, everything in terms of disease diagnostic, different types of, right, whether it be respiratory, intestinal, anything you may be seeing, feel free to reach out to them and do it very, very quickly, right, so that you prevent the spread of disease as much as possible. So, Jessica, I think that's all I had. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those, or if anybody wants to reach out to me at any time by email or by phone, you can contact me. My information's on the Poultry Science Department website at Texas A&M.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Redden. He is the sheep and goat specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension out of San Angelo.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, I'm gonna share my screen here. Maybe. Always forget how to do this. Here we go. All right. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can.
All right. In full view mode?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, good afternoon or early evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of small ruminant vaccination and biosecurity protocols. Just kind of hit the high points. I think we may be a little bit behind on time, so maybe I'll try to catch us up a little bit. Feel free to stop me and ask questions as we move along. I'd be glad to entertain those. Those actually help out with some of these distance education things. And so anyhow, we'll go ahead and get started. I guess first, I always like to stop and look at what health issues are out there. What are the primary ones that we want to kind of focus upon? Sheep and goats are animals that are out and about in pastures. Predation is a big issue in the industry, and so lots of times they're broken down by predation and non-predator losses. Most recent study that I'm aware of is a USDA APHIS study in 2015. And roughly 15,000 sheep are lost, annually due to predators, and close to 20,000 non-predators. Those will be adult animals. When we look at lambs, it's kind of reversed. Predators account for over 30,000 lambs lost each year, and 20,000 of those would be non-predator losses. And so when we look in, because of this is a disease, vaccination, biosecurity type talk, break that out by what are the causes that we're seeing in sheep losses. And so the pie chart here starts at the top and circles around. So the top one is overeating, which accounts for roughly 1% of losses, not that much, although it is our top vaccination protocol. So either we're doing a good job or it's not as problematic as maybe some would be led to believe. Parasites account for roughly 8%, digestive issues, respiratory, metabolic. So just going to the higher ones, other, I don't know, that would be something that's not classified on here, but was known. Weather-related losses, so severe weather conditions that an animal got hypothermic and died. Starvation, 0, kind of hard to believe. Dystocia is a big one. Unfortunately, there's not really a vaccine or a biosecurity protocol for dystocia. Old age, poisoning, and then the biggest one is unknown. So that's a little bit challenging, but it is what it is. So that's for sheep. Now we look at lambs, kind of similar. Again, overeating is only at 1%. We'll talk about that from a vaccination protocol in a minute. Parasites at 8%, a big issue. Lots of times we catch it before death ensues, but a lot of production loss occurs there. Digestive, respiratory at 5%. We move down to weather-related events, hypothermic lambs from very poor weather conditions that they're born in. Starvation is a big one on lambs, and again, this is generally neonatal lambs, dystocia, poisoning, or this unknown. And I'm assuming poisoning would be poisonous plants that the animals would be eating. And so as we stop and look at this, where is vaccination protocols going to come into place? And where are biosecurity things going to come into place to stop some of the major losses that we have? And so overeating is one of those. We'll talk about that. Parasites. There is a vaccine. It's just not available in the United States. It's available internationally. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Digestive issues, not really a vaccination. Respiratory, a common problem. Not as much death loss as maybe someone would think that there is. A vaccination or a vaccine that's out there, but it's not very effective, so it's not used. So as we go down the list, the reality of it is there's just not a lot of major issues that we lose animals to due to that we could prevent with vaccinations. And so, lots of times people are asking me, what do I need to do? What do I need to vaccinate for to improve, my flock and herd health? And, there are a few things, but sometimes if you run out and vaccinate for everything that's out there, you may have prevented a problem, but it's, could also be that you went through a lot of work and effort. And there is the possibility of moving disease around with not changing needles. So you could inflict a little bit of harm. And I don't mean to say this to try and dissuade people from vaccinating, just trying to put the point out there. So one of the criticisms of sheep that I hear from time to time, I'm a sheep guy. I do sheep and goats, but my passion has always been around sheep. It's what I like is, they're prone to die. So I kind of have a tongue-in-cheek comment here. All right, which one of you is going to die today? Who is it? And the reality is they have a pretty strong immune system for the most part. What they don't have, or what people mistake an animal, they just up and died, is they're a flocking animal and they're a prey animal. And so a lot of times they really hide sickness and disease really well. And so we don't see it until it gets to an extreme point, and then we have a rapid death loss event. But if you took a lot of time and observed the animals in a calm environment and not a stressful environment, you'll see a lot of things before death ensues. So, really kind of start with the basic things first. If we want to improve our flock and herd health, to me, it always starts with good, proper nutrition. That's the key element. And if we keep the animals well fed, in good body condition, an appropriate diet for their stage of production, we prevent, 90% of the problems. I'm not saying that that's a number that's been heavily researched, but in reality, that's true. Majority of our problems kind of solve themselves with a healthy, robust animal that has a healthy, immune system. Beyond that, parasite control is probably a big one, especially as you move in, central and eastern part of the state. I always kind of say the general rule is if you get 30 inches of rain a year, you're probably going to be fighting internal parasites with sheep and goats. But we'll talk a little bit about the vaccine. Parasitism is a really complicated topic, and we need several hours to go through it all. So I'll just talk about the vaccination side of it today. Predator prevention is a big part of animal health that we can't let predators come in and take them out. And again, a topic for a different discussion on a different day. So what I'll do from here is kind of go through the common diseases, a little bit of diagnosis, prevention, and treatment, but I'm really going to focus on vaccines and what vaccines are out there, because that was kind of what I was asked to speak upon. So the most commonly used vaccine for sheep and goats is a CD&T. So it's overeating and tetanus. The C&D comes from Clostridium perfringens type C and D. And that prevents this bacteria that proliferates really fast in the digestive tract whenever there's a big change in diet. And it's generally a big improvement in diet. And those bacteria will create a lethal toxin. And so there'll be a rapid death loss. You really won't see much. The animals will get a little bit ill, lay down, and essentially die. The T in CD&T is tetanus. Now, both of them are Clostridium type bacteria, and so they're combined together. I haven't really seen a lot of need to go beyond the CD&T, like a 5-way, a 7-way, an 8-way. That's commonly used in cattle with things like blackleg and other things. And I'm not saying that they don't ever happen, but they're not very common in sheep. And so most people go with the CD&T. It is a little less expensive. And, I'm kind of under the belief that the more things that are in there, maybe the less robust of immune response that you get to each individual ones. Again, I'm not a DVM and I'm an immunologist. That's just kind of the approach that the sheep industry has gone through. So, do you need to vaccinate for Clostridium for overeating if you can control diet and keep them on a good plane of nutrition all the time? No, it's unlikely that will ever occur. Do you need to vaccinate for tetanus? Well, if you dogtails, castrate, ear notch, ear tag, you create an open wound, then there's the potential that they can pick up some type of tetanus, especially if we're doing those in dirtier pens. And particularly, it seems like it's more problematic if horses are kept in those areas that they, I don't know if they're harboring tetanus, but that was kind of the old common knowledge that my grandfather always said, and sometimes you kind of took it tongue in cheek. But as I've went back and things, and I've seen a lot of lambs marked in places where they don't have any horses and they don't vaccinate for these type of things, although they probably should. It's cheaper insurance. They don't have problems with it. So maybe there's some truth to it. If we are going to vaccinate for it, ensure that we're doing that at least a couple of weeks old so that we get the most robust immune response. Lambs and kid goats, for that matter, are born pretty much immunological naive, and it takes a little bit of time for them to start developing their own immune system. So if they're naive to it and we vaccinate for them at a young age, then it's likely it's tying up maternal antibodies for a short period of time. And so there's some kind of research out there that we probably ought to wait till 2-3 weeks of age, and then follow that up, 4 weeks later, somewhere around a weaning time frame. And then an annual booster is recommended. Generally, that's given to pregnant females in that 4 to 8 weeks before lambing, so that you increase their titer levels and they pass a higher level amount to their offspring. And that's the most common one, and that's the one that most everybody uses. After that, it really becomes a bit more hit and miss. So kind of depends on if you have history of the problem that you would use it. The probably most common after CDNT in Texas is sore mouth. So this was actually developed by Texas A&M AgriLife in Sonora quite a long time. It is a live virus. So if you vaccinate for it, you are inoculating the environment at your farm or ranch with this, and you will likely have to continue to vaccinate for it into the future. If you don't have it, it's probably recommended that you don't vaccinate for it and don't introduce it into your environment. And it is zoonotic. So if you handle animals that have these pustules around their mouth and face, and you have a cut or something on your hand, you can pick this up. And of course, the vaccine itself is a live virus, so same thing. If you get that vaccine in a little cut or something on your hands, you very much will develop this. And it's a pretty painful infection on your hand. The next, probably most common vaccine for sheep and goats in Texas is caseous lymphadenitis, also called CL. The bacteria is Corynebacterium pseudotuberculosis. There were 2 vaccines, one for sheep that was made by Caseback, or that is made by Caseback, or is made by Colorado Serum, and it's called Caseback. It is specifically for sheep, and some reports say that it's not that effective in goats. Texas Vet Lab, which is a diagnostic or a pharmaceutical company here in San Angelo, had produced one specifically for goats. Unfortunately, they no longer produce that commercially. They will make an autogenous vaccine for you if you so choose, but they just didn't sell enough of it to justify keeping the license around. This one, it can be kind of harsh on the animals when you give it to them. And they get pretty sore over time. Plus, if you are ever doing any herd or flock, surveillance and doing antibody titers, you can't tell the vaccine from the disease itself. And so somebody wanted to know that you're CL free, and they wanted a blood test. If you vaccinated for it, you may come up as hot. Again, if you've seen it in the past, it's probably a good idea to vaccinate replacements. In the past, they'd always had if you see lumps, drain it, clean it up, and then cull the animal. Well, if you drain it and you clean it, you inoculate the environment a bit more. It will likely bust on its own. So if you keep the animals around, but the research station in Sonora has been culling goats on this had been culling goats on this for over 20 years, and it was still present. So the cull never really gets rid of it. You're going to have to vaccinate your way out of this. And even kind of more random vaccines that you'll see in sheep and goats is for aborting diseases. The most common would be Vibrio, chlamydia, or lepto. A picture of each of those is across the bottom. And again, most people aren't vaccinating for this unless they've had abortions in the past and they know they have it. Some people will be a little bit more risk averse and would vaccinate for these things. The downside to some of these vaccines, well, the lepto is not even labeled for sheep and goats, so you would have to work with your veterinarian to determine if that's an appropriate one to use. And chlamydia tends to be strain specific. So even if you vaccinate for it, you may pick up another strain and still get it. And the Vibrio tends to be a pretty good vaccine for the best of my understanding. These aren't ultra common in Texas because they're moved around a lot by the females during the birthing time frame. And a lot of these flocks and herds around the state are, especially the commercial ones, are kept fairly close. They don't bring a whole lot of females on to the place that are, mature age that would have picked this up before. So a lot of this tends to be more prominent in show herds where they're, selling females and buying females rather routinely. And then it does become problematic. It is important to probably have some biosecurity of rams. If you're buying an outside ram, they tend not to move these around except during a breeding season from ewe to ewe. And so if you'll have a 2-week to a 1-month biosecurity, bring in a new ram, don't turn him out with the ewes right away. If he came off of ewes at another operation, give him about 2 weeks to kind of clean up, and you're unlikely to pick this up from rams. A rare vaccination in Texas, unless you live in the hotspot, would be anthrax. And so there's a picture on the bottom left is kind of the hot zone for anthrax where it's endemic in the area. You kind of draw a triangle from Ozona to Uvalde to Eagle Pass. And in that region right there, anthrax is real common. In a couple of years ago, I think 2018, 2019, we had the right conditions, a really wet spring, a hot, dry summer. This thing popped up and was pretty problematic. It killed a lot of horses, cows, some sheep and goats, and then just devastated the white-tailed deer population in the regions where it was at. We have a ranch that's in the northwest corner of that triangle. It's an AgriLife property, and there was in the neighborhood of 500 to 700 deer on that ranch generally. And today, even about 2 years after the fact, there's only maybe a dozen deer. So it was pretty devastating. You can vaccinate, of course, your livestock, not so much the wildlife. And if you live in that area, it should be a standard every spring to vaccinate for anthrax. Some even more rare vaccinations to try and prevent pneumonia or mastitis. Mannheimia hemolytica is a real common form of respiratory disease in sheep and goats. There is a Bactrin out there, but I haven't seen any data that it really helps to prevent disease, or if it is, I haven't run across it. There's a newer one called Vimco, which is for mastitis. Again, I can't remember the exact data. I remember reading up on it, and it did not seem like it was really going to help the commercial sheep and goat operations prevent mastitis. But both of those are fairly common diseases, may not cause death, so to speak. Pneumonia may. Mastitis is generally calling an early animal unless it gets severe and gangrenous. That doesn't come out. A vaccine that would be fantastic if we had is called Barbervax. So this is a vaccine that you would give to sheep and goats. It does not prevent that they will ever get an internal parasite load that would lead to animal production loss. But in essence, what it does is it primes the system. So I believe it's supposed to be given 2 or 3 times, 2 weeks apart, leading up to the wet spring where we typically have our parasite issues, and gets these animals ready and more prepared for a parasite challenge. So that one would be probably used quite a bit if it was made available here in the United States. So if we think about biosecurity, independent, if the vaccine is not going to work, what are the diseases that we need to be worried about? Most all of them are coming on sheep and goats. Potentially foot rot could be coming from a person bringing it on, but most of these other diseases are pretty species specific, and they're not going to last on a human for very long in transition. So foot rot is the one that most people are worried about, but you need to be in a fairly high rainfall region. West central part of the state, we don't really have it that much at all because it's just never wet enough long enough to propagate it. The aggressive form of foot rot, it only lives about 7 days outside the animal. So if we go through a dry spell, it kind of cleans up. But that's one that you need to be worried about. Of course, the aborting agents, we talked about those. Those are generally coming in females that have been infected with it. They've developed immunity, but they're still shedding it, and so they will shed it out to other females. They're naive to it, and if they pick that up during pregnancy, they could lose that pregnancy. Brucella ovis is a disease of the rams. The rams pass it to each other. It'll cause knots in the epididymis. They'll go sterile. It's not ultra common, but every now and again it makes its way back. And the bad thing about it, it's generally in bigger operations where they may have 20 or 30 rams that they're using. One ram gets it, spreads it to the rest of them, and next thing you know, about half of your ram battery is infertile. One that we probably don't think about as much as we should is drug-resistant parasites. So, buying sheep from an operation where they repeatedly drench and rotate drenches all the time and create an environment where those parasites have time to develop resistance to dewormers. We only have 3 classes of dewormers here in the U.S. And so once they develop resistance to 2 or 3 of those classes, you're really in a tight position because you can't treat them at that point. CL, we talked about that one before. It's knots. We used to think that it was transmitted at the shearing floor whenever we sheared sheep and they nicked them or they hit one of these pustules and it opened up and other sheep are being shorn and they have little open wounds. But now we see it more commonly in meat goats and hair sheep. Neither of those are routinely sheared unless it's a show operation. So there's good reason to believe that it's probably moving from animal to animal. Either they get a pustule in their lungs and they cough it up and another one inhales it, or we're not changing needles and animals are being, one's vaccinated right after the other. We're not changing needles and we're moving that disease through a flock or a herd. Sore mouth can become in animals that don't have any clinical signs of it. Could be bringing it with them and shedding it, and so we get in a position where we'd had to vaccinate into the future. Scrapie is a prion disease, kind of like mad cow disease, chronic wasting in deer. Generally, the animals that are infected with that will start showing symptoms 2 or 3 years of age. They pick that up. Girls. They'll pick that up from their mother at birth, and it's really a vertical transmission from ewe to lamb. There's a national scrapie surveillance program. That's why animals have to be tagged when they're sold, trying to trace that back. We went from that being about 1% of the industry to about 0.001%, so we just almost got it eradicated, but not quite there. Ovine progressive pneumonia and caprine encephalitis, arthritic encephalitis, both of those are diseases that aren't ultra common here in Texas. It's not cold enough. We don't confine them in barns as much as they do up north where it's more problematic. A weird disease. It kind of works a little bit like HIV. Some animals get it and they never show signs. Some animals get it and we see clinical symptoms. But a big part of it, if you can have a closed flock or herd, that's ideal. Most people don't have enough animals to do that, and if they do, they'll start getting inbreeding pretty quickly. A 2-week quarantine period, probably at minimum, is highly suggested. Bring animals in, put them in a pen by themselves, feed them, let them shed out, recover from any diseases that they may have picked up in transit. Kind of clear the system before we integrate them into other flocks and herds. If we can't close our herd, but we can just bring in outside males, that's going to stop a lot of the aborting agents and other diseases that might come in on females. And if you do bring in females, it's highly suggested that you birth the new animals away from the old group so that they're not transmitting those aborting agents. Ask questions from people that have a lot of experience. Unfortunately, if you start searching the internet for diseases, whatever you think is out there, you will find something out there on the World Wide Web. And so there's a lot of things out there. And I strongly encourage you to develop a vet-client-patient relationship where you have someone who's trained in these type of things to help work through what should be your vaccination protocol, what should be your biosecurity, how to diagnose diseases and things of that such. So with that, I'll take questions if we have time for it. If not, I'll hang out. And if you need to reach me, my contact information was on the first page there. So with that, thanks, Jessica, for inviting me. Hopefully some of this information that I shared is useful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Redden. All right, so we don't have any questions. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Hank Hayes. He's the Regional Director of the Sulphur Springs region of the Texas Animal Health Commission.
Give me just a second to the presentation hooked up here. Okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to talk to y'all about tonight is livestock movements and entry requirements for coming into Texas, but also leaving Texas. So, and a lot of this does kind of fall into the biosecurity realm in a way. Every state in the United States has a certain disease status for each livestock disease. So, of course, if we have a good status, we want to protect that. We want to keep disease out of our state. And as we move animals to other states, they have the same protections. And then the same is true. If we want to keep it out of our state, we want to keep it out of a county, and we want to keep it out of our farm. And so anyway, we'll go ahead and kind of go on with that. I want to tell you a little bit about our agency. It is a state agency that is kind of the counterpart of USDA, APHIS Veterinary Services in Texas. And we'll talk a little bit about how it started in the animal movement regulations, specifically for intrastate, inside the state, but also interstate, and then conclusion of that. This is a very basic presentation. There's actually quite a lot of regulations on it that we deal with on a daily basis. Our agency was actually established back in 1893. It actually had to do with a kind of a biosecurity or a prevention measure due to implementation of a quarantine on Texas cattle. So back in those days, they were still having the cattle drives in the late 1800s. And a lot of South Texas cattle were infested with cattle fever ticks, what we call cattle fever ticks. And cattle fever ticks were in Texas, but they also spread all across the southeastern United States. They went up through central Texas into Oklahoma. And then if you draw a line kind of from Oklahoma to Virginia, pretty much everything south of that line had cattle fever ticks and potentially could get the disease called babesiosis, or as it was referred to back then, Texas cattle fever, from these ticks that were carrying it. And of course, you have to have three components. You have to have cattle that are carriers of the disease, and in the area where they have it endemically, those cattle are basically immune to that disease. But where cattle are naive to that disease, it causes almost 90% mortality. So what the issue is as they drove the cattle north from South Texas, these ticks would fall along the trails where they were doing the trail drives. And so as these cattle crossed into Oklahoma and Kansas, going to Dodge City or any other railhead, Missouri, these fever ticks would fall off, get on the local cattle in those states, and then about 90% of those cattle in those herds in those states would die. So we weren't making very good friends with our neighboring states. So the Secretary of Agriculture in 1893 put a quarantine on all Texas cattle where they could not leave our state until we cleaned our act up. And that's when the Livestock Sanitary Commission was formed, which is now called the Texas Animal Health Commission. So basically, those states, we were having our trade restricted, which was a huge deal at the time, because we had a disease issue that we were spreading to them. So we remain, true to the charge of evolving with the times and keeping our animals healthy and marketable for all of Texas livestock poultry, but for other states and also for international export. So we work to assure livestock and poultry health, do disease and eradication, control and eradication in order to prevent production loss, maintain trade avenues. And then we also respond to emergencies, which could be livestock disease outbreaks, but also to natural disasters like floods, tornadoes, and hurricanes. Our legislative authority from the Texas legislature gives us legislative authority for these diseases in prevention, control, and eradication of diseases in these species of animals. So cattle, equine, swine, poultry, sheep and goats, certain exotic fowl, and exotic livestock, and then also in whitetail deer, mule deer, and elk. And so there's a lot of examples of different diseases that are regulatory. Some of them are not. Our agency is broken into regions. I'm the director of the Sulphur Springs region. And so in Cass County, you're well in our region, even though you're pretty close to Arkansas. But so we take care of this part of the state. As far as livestock movement regulations, those are all found basically in two places. They can be found on our website that you see here listed first. And all of the entry requirements for livestock coming into Texas can be found there. There are also some federal regulations on movement across state lines. And then if you want to move animals into other states, you have to check with the state veterinary offices in those states to move them into those states. And generally that's done through issuing of health certificates, a health inspection from a veterinarian, and that veterinarian has to check with the state of destination to determine what those entry requirements are, whether it be vaccinations, whether it be testing, or just statements of health of those animals. So as far as who regulates that, again, it's USDA, APHIS Veterinary Services, and as far as livestock, poultry, and exotic livestock, it's our agency, and then to some small extent, the Department of State Health Services on pets. So why do we regulate these movements? Mainly to prevent and eradicate and control diseases. So it becomes a little involved because there are multiple agencies involved, but the goal is the same, to ensure the health and marketability of these animals. Okay, so we'll be talking a little bit about intrastate, but also more specifically about interstate. So if you're not crossing a state line, it's intrastate, and vice versa. If you're crossing a state line, it is interstate. Now, all livestock, and that's all of those species involved, are by law have to have a health certificate to cross state lines, with one exception, and that is cattle can cross state lines as long as they are coming from a producer directly to a livestock market, a sale barn in an adjoining state or any other state as far as that goes. And that only applies to producers. That would be a rancher, farmer. It would not include cattle coming from a dealer trader or a cattle trader. So those, just one species, cattle, can cross a state line. In other words, if you live in Paris, Texas, You can take your cattle to a livestock market, say in Idabel, Oklahoma. If you live in Idabel, Oklahoma, you can take your cattle to Paris, Texas, to the livestock market, as long as you are a producer. In other words, we know, so we can have disease traceability from one state to another when those animals move. So if there's a disease condition found in those animals later on, we can go back to the farm of origin. If it is a cattle dealer, they have to get a health certificate to bring those same animals back, because they are not the person that raised the animals, and we cannot trace them back to them specifically because that's not the farm of origin, the farm or ranch of origin. Okay, as far as interstate movement, some species do not require a health certificate to move in Texas, and as a matter of fact, most do not. So you kind of have to know when to do that. Your veterinarian can help you with that. A health certificate, we call them health certificates. The actual name is a certificate of veterinary inspection, or CVI. And one of the things that you might want to check on is if you're going to a livestock show. As it turns out, if the livestock show only has entrants from Texas, they do not necessarily have to have a health certificate. However, if they allow out-of-state participants at that livestock show, then everyone that is going to participate in that show has to have a health certificate. So that's something that's a little specific to a show. Now, all that being said, livestock shows themselves can require health certificates regardless, even if all of the participants are from inside Texas. So it's up to the people that are having the show to determine that. Also, they have to meet our minimum standards to do what they're doing, but they can have more stringent standards if they want to. So that's something that you always need to check with the show that livestock are going to in order to participate in their show, to see if they have requirements that are over and above state requirements. One other area where people are not allowed to move livestock is if they are placed under a hold order or a quarantine by our state agency, by the Texas Animal Health Commission. And a hold order is a little different than a quarantine. A quarantine basically means a specific disease that is regulated has been confirmed on that premise or on that farm or ranch. A hold order means that disease is suspected on that farm or ranch, but testing has not yet revealed that. So there is a slight difference. Sometimes when we think there's a disease issue, there are maybe samples taken to see if an animal or multiple animals have a certain disease. They are put under a hold order where no animals can leave that farm. And once we confirm that they're positive, then we issue a quarantine, which is a little stronger type of restriction. As far as interstate exhibition movement requirements and specifically going to shows, it's best to check with the THC rules, and there is a specific document that has requirements for shows. You can also check with the permit department at the phone number that's listed there. So that basically all of the shows have to meet our requirements, but they, again, like I said before, they may have additional restrictions or requirements. As far as interstate movement, that's a whole different thing. So if you are interested in selling animals to other people out of state, then before those animals leave, you need to consult with your veterinarian to see what's required to go to, say, Mississippi or Alabama or Colorado. And your veterinarian, it's their responsibility when they write that health certificate to check with that state, the state of destination, to see what the requirements are. One thing that's important here to know is that sometimes a state may require a test that has not been done on the animal, and it may take some period of time to get test results back. So don't just walk into your veterinarian's office, expect to get a health certificate right then, and then hit the road to that state. there may actually be a test that may require several days, maybe up to a week to get results on. So check with your veterinarian there. If you are going to go to another state and say purchase a bull coming into Texas, if they're 12 months of age and older, has to have a negative trick test. Dr. Banna talked about that disease, but they have to have a negative trick test to come into our state if they're a breeding bull and they're 12 months of age or older. And so if you go to Oklahoma or somewhere to buy a bull, and that animal doesn't have a current trick test at the time you buy it, you're going to have to wait until their veterinarian can get a trick test done, and you'll have to make another trip back to Oklahoma to pick the bull up. So just be expecting that there may be some requirements for testing that may take extra time. Some general interstate requirements: all species that are affected, exposed, or quarantined for any kind of disease may not enter our state. For instance, if there was vesicular stomatitis going on in equine or horses or cattle, say in New Mexico, in a particular county or an geographic area, we're probably not going to permit them to move while that disease is going on in that state, even if they're not an affected premise, just so that we won't get it. So this is done basically on a case-by-case basis, depending on where they're coming from into our state. Here again, all of this is basic biosecurity measures, just to prevent disease from coming into our state. It's no different than when we shut down international flights from China to here when the COVID virus first started going. So as far as general interstate requirements, a CVI or a certificate of veterinary inspection, a health certificate, so to speak, is required. It's good for 30 days from the time that it's issued, and it'll have an issue date on it. And the veterinarian has to have seen that animal within the last 10 days to do that. A veterinarian should not be writing health certificates on animals they have never seen. They actually have to examine them and certify their health. So they have to be issued by an accredited veterinarian. Sometimes movement from one state to another requires an entry permit. Here again, it's up to your veterinarian to check and see if that state requires an entry permit for that specific type of animal or category of livestock. And in Texas, if you're bringing animals back into Texas that do require a permit, those permits are only good for 15 days. So anyway, that can be determined by calling the permit office or emailing the permit office that you see here in Texas. And that's if you're bringing livestock into Texas. Please keep in mind, this is for all species, and it even includes poultry. And part of our job is to work state lines. We do it periodically and check livestock vehicles coming in, whether they're poultry, swine, cattle, equine, horses, whatever. So we're looking for people that are violating our requirements, because we don't want for them to come into our state without meeting those requirements and possibly bringing us disease. Some of the things that may be required for a health certificate: testing and sometimes vaccinations, not usually many vaccinations, but certain tests like a EIA test or a Coggins test on a horse, or a trick test on a bull, or avian influenza test on poultry. Statements of disease freedom. A good example of this, we have a specific entry requirement for hogs or swine coming into our state for PED, porcine epidemic diarrhea. It's very contagious, and all the veterinarian in another state has to do is to certify that those animals have not originated from a farm that has had that disease in the last 30 days. So it's just statements that of disease freedom, so to speak. Official identification requirements. So all species have to have official ID. In cattle, most of the time those are the silver brucellosis test tags, orange brucellosis vaccination tags, 840 RFID radio frequency ID tags and those type of things. There are some others. Sheep have to have scrapie tags, and it's a little different type of tag that is required for sheep and goats. So there are specific requirements for those, and you can find those out through USDA or from our agency as well. So kind of in conclusion, always check with the livestock show health certificate requirements for shows in Texas well in advance of the show so that all requirements are met. As a practicing veterinarian, I frequently had young people going to shows, and they would maybe need a TB test to take a dairy animal to an out-of-state show. And a TB test takes 3 days. But if they show up to my office one day before they're supposed to drive the animal to Mississippi or wherever it is, to Memphis, say Memphis, Tennessee, to a show, then they've waited too long, and I cannot write them a health certificate. So it's important to do your homework ahead of time, find out what's required before you're going to be moving animals out of Texas or into Texas. And then always get a veterinarian to issue the health certificates prior to moving the livestock, which includes the official ID, testing, vaccination requirements, and any statements. Okay, some common mistakes that we see on this is not using official ID tags for cattle and hogs, and not using scrapie tags in sheep and goats. Now, your veterinarian will have or should have official ID for cattle and swine. However, they are not able to issue scrapie tags. You have to call this toll-free number right here, and you can order scrapie tags for sheep and goats there. And they do have more than just a unique individual identification number for that animal. They have a flock number or a herd number as well, and that is a specific herd number to your premise. You should never have a health certificate to be used for multiple destinations. The health certificate will have the consignor, which is who the shipper is, and it'll have the destination on there, which is a consignee. And that health certificate is good for one movement. It's for movement from the consignor to the consignee. It is not, and so you can't use it to go to multiple destinations, even if it's in the same state. Another example of a mistake is not having a current EIA test or a Coggins for a horse or a donkey or a mule, or failure to get an entry permit. And of course, here again, that the veterinarian should get the entry permit. Check if the state of destination requires that. Kind of in summary, movement requirements are in place to prevent the spread of these livestock diseases, but to protect the marketability of our products here in Texas. So always check the requirements and regulations before you transport any animals to avoid issues. Check the state of destination if they're going out of state, individual events, and check USDA and Texas Animal Health Commission rules. And that's all I have, unless there are any questions.
I'm not seeing any questions. That was really thorough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good night.
All right. Take care.